Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar discussion. I know folks are sort of slowly coming into the room, so we want to go ahead and get started. My name is Reid. I have the pleasure of serving as the Senior Director of Advocacy for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And NACDL, we are a professional bar association. We are committed to preserving fairness and promoting a rational and humane criminal legal system. And we do this by identifying and reforming flaws and inequities in our criminal legal system, and also seeking to redress systemic racism. We have partnered with our colleagues at the Sentencing Project to bring you today's webinar discussion, which will be guaranteeing voting rights to people with felony convictions. As many of you may know, a criminal conviction can really lead to permanent loss of voting rights. And what we know is disenfranchising millions of Americans due to a conviction severely undercuts the promise of democracy and weakens the power of these communities, particularly those who have been most harmed by the criminal legal system. Though many states have sought to enact laws that provide some level of relief, however, the patchwork of laws governing the restoration of voting rights is often complex, and making the restoration of voting rights inaccessible and often unattainable to many who have tried to get their rights restored. And many who have sought to get their rights restored or believe they have qualified for relief under their states have now been being targeted and prosecuted for voter fraud. Today's panel discussion is going to be moderated by my colleague, Nicole Porter. She serves as the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. She will be joined by Washington State Representative Tarra Simmons, League of Women Voters of Florida President Cecile Scoon, and James Carpenter with More Than Our Crimes. Now, before I turn over to Nicole to get us started, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. One, we really encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, where you're from. For questions for the panelists, they will be taking questions toward the end of their conversation. We ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we do apologize if we can't get to all of the questions. We will try to answer as many as we can live on today's webinar. Nicole, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you, Monica, and thank you to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers for partnering with the Sentencing Project on guaranteeing voting rights for all, including those completing their sentence inside and outside of prison. I am Nicole, and I am the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, where I manage the state advocacy portfolio that includes a range of priorities from documenting prison closures and their repurposing to felony enfranchisement. The Sentencing Project is a bridge organization between the Academy and the activists, and I work specifically with state advocacy organizers on campaigns to shift hearts and minds on the nation's punitive sentencing policies, including collateral consequences like felony disenfranchisement. I'm going to give a roadmap for our conversation over the next hour, and then we'll get into it. First, I'll provide some framing comments and then we will get into the dialogue with our panelists who will anchor the discussion with guiding questions. I will also invite them to introduce more about themselves as they give answers to those questions. Then before the top of the hour, we will turn to you all for questions and feedback. So please share your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar portal, and we'll get to them, as many as we can, like Monica mentioned earlier. So now for some framing comments. The Sentencing Project has worked to popularize the number of persons impacted by felony disenfranchisement since the late 1990s. As of 2020, 5.2 million Americans were prohibited from voting due to laws that disenfranchise citizens convicted of felony offenses. Felony disenfranchisement rates vary by state, as states institute a wide range of policies that exclude people from the franchise. The general narrative assumes that justice-involved residents cannot vote. This is baked into the culture, and I've seen the misconception shared in movies and TV shows and shared widely on Saturday morning talk shows by pundits who don't realize the policy nuances that vary from state to state. On the history of felony disenfranchisement, English settler colonialists brought the practice with them to North America, the common law practice of civil death, a set of criminal penalties that included the revocation of voting rights. Early colonial laws limited the penalty of disenfranchisement to certain offenses related to voting or considered, quote, egregious violations of the moral code, unquote. After the American Revolution, States began codifying disenfranchisement provisions and expanding the penalty to all felony offenses. Many states instituted felony disenfranchisement policies in the wake of the Civil War, and by 1869, 29 states had enacted such laws. During the post-Reconstruction era, several Southern states tailored their disenfranchisement laws in order to bar Black male voters specifically, targeting those offenses believed to be committed most frequently by the Black population. For example, white elites in Mississippi called for disenfranchisement of offenses such as burglary, theft, and arson, but not for robbery or murder. The author of Alabama's disenfranchisement provision stated, quote, estimated the crime of wife beating alone would disqualify 60% of quote, the Negroes, unquote, resulting in a policy that would disenfranchise a man for beating his wife, but not for killing her. In Mississippi, individuals have to get legislation introduced and passed the way any bill is introduced. Since 1997, 410 bills were introduced on behalf of individual residents. A resident with a felony conviction history that's disenfranchised by the Mississippi State Constitution, there are 12. There are specific laws in Mississippi's Constitution that enumerate disenfranchising offenses. They have to work with their state representative or state senator to introduce a bill on their behalf. And like any law or any proposed bill, it has to get considered in committee, pass out of committee, pass through one chamber into the next, and then on to the governor it goes. And in recent years, 32 residents sought their voting rights from Mississippi in this way and had legislation filed on their behalf. And yet only 2 persons won their voting rights back in 2021 because of bills that made their way to the governor's desk, and the Mississippi governor ended up signing legislation that reinstated their voting rights. Today, there continues to be a disproportionate impact of felony disenfranchisement on the Black electorate. This aligns with the cumulative impact of racial disparities and other aspects of the criminal legal system. Since the 1980s, residents have had a higher chance of coming in contact with the police, going to prison, and getting a felony conviction that has disenfranchised many in many states. And the anti-Blackness that drives mass incarceration, resulting in punitive criminal legal system policies, is bad for everyone, including Black residents. The nation's punitiveness has caught Latinx residents and disenfranchised them. As states began expanding voting rights in the civil rights era, the disenfranchisement rate dropped between 1960 and 1970. Although reform efforts have been substantial in recent years, the number of people disenfranchised was 1.17 million in 1976 and nearly 5.2 million as of 2020. It is beyond time for these voting rights bans to be undone. The country's history is marked by different groups seeking their full rights as citizens. That is a history to be celebrated and acknowledged, from Black men seeking the franchise during Reconstruction to women seeking the franchise more than 100 years ago, now with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and other marginalized groups as well. The voting ban must also be undone to continue the work of perfecting this nation's democracy. And what greater way to kick off National Voting Rights Month than to have this conversation with my colleagues who will join me in a minute. But still, there are 11 extreme states that restrict voting rights for all, depending on what their felony crime of conviction was, even long after they've completed their prison term and are no longer on probation and parole. Such as individuals in those states make up 50% of the entire disenfranchised population. And 2 states, Maine and Vermont, allow people to vote in prison. And most recently, the franchise was expanded to people in prison custody who were sentenced from Washington, D.C., and they joined people who got the franchise in Puerto Rico in the 80s. Persons currently in prison or jail represent a minority of the total disenfranchised population. And in fact, 77% of disenfranchised voters live in the community under probation or parole. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my comments and just say that we're going to get into a discussion on ways to expand the franchise, talk about the activism that's happening that is helping to build out democracy and add more people to the voting rolls. And we're going to get into a conversation with Cecile, James, and Representative Simmons from Washington State. So I'm going to turn it over to James and Representative Simmons first, who will each be given an opportunity to provide additional comments on their background as well as answer the question I'll share with them. And that is, the first question is, what have we done to address felony disenfranchisement in the recent years? And how has your work and your experience helped inform the advocacy and activism that you've been leading on? And I'll start with you, James, and then go with you to you, Representative Simmons.
How's everyone doing? I'm here for More Than Our Crimes, Washington, D.C. based organization that advocates for voting rights for guys incarcerated. D.C. is we're in a unique situation because we actually do have voting for those incarcerated. People incarcerated has actually voted in their own local ANC in DC jail. It was a historic win. Some of the problems that we face with this is DC doesn't have a state prison per se, so a lot of our inmates are sent, I hate to use that word, but are sent across the United States in federal prison. So that has all different types of problems because the federal prisons, each one of them is run like their own kingdom. So some of them are not they're not accommodating to voting in certain states as others. And it has been a problem in terms of advocacy. It's a robust movement here in DC. We have a lot of different organizations that are participating in and trying to keep and bring uniformity to the voting process to make it go smoothly. This year was a little better than last, but there's still a lot of other work to be done.
Great, thank you, James. And Representative Simmons.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, no matter where you're at. It is sometime wherever you're at. I am Representative Tarra Simmons. I represent the 23rd Legislative District in Washington State. I ran for office based on my lived experience of being in and out of foster care and jail and juvenile detention and prison. And really seeing that our voices are not centered in policies because we don't have representation as formerly incarcerated people. Before I joined the legislature in 2020, I was an activist and founded and still to this day run a nonprofit organization that is led by and for formerly incarcerated people working on sentencing and collateral consequences mostly and reentry and record vacation and things like that. So when I joined the legislature, I had already been very active in trying to restore the right to vote for people who've been incarcerated. The laws have changed over the last 10 years in Washington State. With my first adult felony conviction, I wasn't allowed to vote until I paid off all of my legal financial obligations and was done with my community custody. And that is problematic for somebody who wants to serve in public office because your ability to serve in public office is tied to your ability to vote. In Washington, if you are a registered voter, you can run for office. And so because I couldn't afford to pay my court fines and fees and I was on community custody, I wasn't able to vote during my first felony conviction, but the law changed in 2009. And people were allowed to vote if you were making payments on your legal financial obligations. That was still problematic because, rich people or people who had means to pay their court fines and fees could vote. And if you didn't have money, you couldn't vote. And so fortunately in 2009, we changed that. The prosecutor could take away your right to vote if you weren't making payments, but they never did. So it wasn't being implemented. People were not having their rights taken away, but it was kind of in a gray area where they could if the prosecutor wanted to. And so before I joined the legislature, I started working with representatives and senators. And for 2 sessions, we had introduced a bill that would restore the right to vote immediately upon exiting prison, even if you were on community supervision, even if you couldn't pay your legal financial obligations. However, it was really hard to get that bill passed. And even in Washington, where we had a trifecta, the Democrats hold both chambers, the House and the Senate, and the governor governor's office, and we couldn't get that bill through. And then I got elected in 2020. And I really started to see the power of having representation and people with lived experience inside the legislature, and the way that the political process works on the inside is much different than what I was trying to push up against when I was an activist on the outside. And, people will want me to vote for their things too. And now I have power, and I can say, I'm not going to vote for, something that you want unless you join with me and vote for what I want. And I really prioritized. This was my freshman bill in 2020, my very first piece of legislation when I got elected. And fortunately, I was even able to get a Republican co-sponsor. And that was through a miracle, and finding out that this Republican had a mother who was in recovery from substance use disorder, and he had grown up in kind of the rooms of 12-step programs and saw a lot of people who needed a second chance. And my Republican co-sponsor, he's the only Republican that voted with me, but we got that bill through the finish line, and the governor signed it in 2021. And, it took not just me working on the inside, but also building a huge coalition of amazing activists locally and partnering with folks nationally to lead, communications and education. And now, in Washington State, we re-enfranchised, I think we're on 26,000 people who were on community custody, in work releases, on electronic home monitoring, and couldn't vote. Now, as long as your head is not on a state-issued pillow, and you are leaving 24-hour confinement of prison, you can vote. That means people in our jails can vote, and people, like I said, that are on electronic home monitoring, work releases, community custody, and it doesn't matter if you can afford your court fines and fees or not. The only people left that we need to get re-enfranchised are the people that are currently in 24-hour lockdown in a state prison. And I think it's around 13,000 people still in Washington. And that's going to take a constitutional amendment. And so we're working on building the power and the activism and the support to eventually get the supermajority needed to re-enfranchise everyone. And right now we are working with, we got a budget provision through last session that, is partnering with organizations that are led by people with lived experience to go into the jail and register people and make sure they have access to their rights. Because right now people in jail can vote, but they just don't have access to the ballot. And so that's what we're doing now. The work continues, and we're so excited to continue to partner across this nation and build that support. And I really think we need to get more people with lived experience elected inside also across America. So I'm really grateful to be here and be with all of you.
Thank you so much, Representative Simmons. Such exciting work out of Washington and such exciting work out of DC. James, it was talking about the work that More Than Our Crimes is doing. That builds on the expansion of the law, expansion of the franchise to people inside in criminal custody in the Federal Bureau of Prisons that was adopted in 2020 as part of the DC Restore the Vote Act. So thank you to you both for the leadership that you're doing and the work that's happening, which is in partnership with active campaigns happening across this country, expanding the franchise to people regardless of their criminal conviction status, whether or not those folks are in prison or whether or not those folks are living in the community with a prior conviction history or under supervision on probation or parole, felony probation or parole. So, and there's so much work to be done. Once we get rights back, once we expand political rights, then there's the question about implementation and how to sustain rights. And so, Cecile, I'm going to go to you next, but we're going to come back to you, James, and Representative Simmons for some additional questions in a minute. You're in Florida. Florida has been on the national news lately, and Florida's in some mess for many reasons, including the fact that following the adoption of Amendment 4 a few years ago, the effort to narrow the political rights that were supported by a majority of Floridians has been done by Florida lawmakers and by the current governor. So my question for you is, can you give us an update on Florida? The Sentencing Project has partnered with Desmond Meade at the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and other Florida activists, and we're so happy for you to join us today. Can you give us an update on what's going on in Florida and where things currently are in addressing the folks who have been targeted, I would say politically targeted, because of their prior conviction history? And we can get into the details of it, but for people, in the audience who may be unaware, there have been a range of cases in the last couple of months dating back to voting participation in the 2020 election by incarcerated individuals who were in Florida jails. I think it's at least one county, Alachua County. There may be more. Cecile, please add additional context when you can. Someone in the chat says 20 people arrested. Several people have already pled guilty to the offenses of being charged with voter fraud or some voter fraud related offense because they had a prior criminal conviction and had not completed their fines and fees. And can you explain more detail, give more detail to that, Cecile, and also what is going on now in Florida around these cases?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to join such a informed and powerful panel. And at our part, I want to echo what Representative Simmons says. I think there are many of us who are volunteers and activists, and our hearts are touched, and we really want to make a difference. And we do a lot of great work. There's so many of us. But when you pair that intense commitment to making change with someone who has a lived experience, you're starting to cook with gas. It's just a whole nother elevation of the issue, and the ability to talk from the heart and the experience. And we had that with Desmond Meade, who you referenced, and a good friend. And I was just with him at the convening. They had their 10th annual convening this last weekend, 2 days ago. But the things that the lived experience brings, it just makes it real. It makes it human. It's undeniable. It's not just like a progressive, a liberal person who's just, weeping in an armchair. This is a real person, and they have real stories and victories and limits. So that piece of the ingredient is really, really key, and I think really helped us in Florida. We had a citizens initiative initially because we kept going to our legislators and they wouldn't listen to us. So the citizens took it upon ourselves, and we have a process in Florida where you can get signatures on a ballot, and then it can on a petition, and then it can be placed on the ballot. And we won. Almost 65% of the people of all races voted for the second chances and allowing people to who had completed their felony conviction sentences to vote again. As Nicole said, shortly after that, the legislators got involved and said, we want to fine tune that. And they spelled out that the returning citizens had to pay all their financial obligations in their sentence. And something that is not spoken of, there was a sentence that was protected that would have allowed about 800,000 people to vote right away. And that was the conversion to a civil lien. If there was a conversion, if the judge converted your financial obligations to a civil lien, that meant you had no more financial obligations. And we had about 800,000 of those people. They could have voted on day one. The last day of legislators, they pulled that out, and that took away our entry. So it was a real kind of disappointment. So now what we have done is people were very, very upset about it. We litigated. We had a tremendous victory at trial. It went to what I consider the most conservative appellate court in the state, in my opinion, the 11th Circuit. And two judges who had just recently come from Florida and had been elevated from the Florida Supreme Court to the 11th Circuit, a federal system. Those two judges had ruled on an Amendment 4 issue just a few months before. And instead of recusing themselves, they turned around and voted against the litigation that we had won, to say that forcing people to pay their fines before they vote is a form of taxation. And it was a close vote. It was just by one vote. So we've kind of been done bad in Florida. But there were some provisions in the law that said you can go into court and you can seek a modification of your sentence to convert your fines and fees to community service, or the judge, he or she actually has the ability to modify the sentence. And so that's what we're working on right now. The league has written 2 continuing legal education programs, which we offer for free, and then to help people learn about how to modify sentence, because for most of us older lawyers, which I'm a lawyer, but if you didn't appeal your sentence in 30 days, unless you had a collateral attack like DNA was withheld, you were done. So people were like, how can you do this? What's going on? So we put that little stepping stone there, and we are asking lawyers to sign up to get that training. And then we're doing a referral service. And I put in the little chat at the beginning, if you scroll to the very top, we have a dedicated number and we have a dedicated email, canivote@lwvfl.org. And when we ask returning citizens and we ask criminal defense lawyers, we say, let your clients know about this opportunity, because we don't want people to be arrested because they were mistaken about their voting rights. So that's what we're doing right now. And we do have the challenge, as Nicole also mentioned, about the governor, in our opinion, doing political theater and grandstanding, going after people who thought they had the right to vote and arresting them with SWAT teams, helicopters, taking them out of their house in their underwear, when we know that there are known cases that the governor has known about, let's say in the villages, where people voted twice. It happened to be, of a certain party, the governor's party. No SWAT teams flew in there. They were not dragged out in handcuffs in their underwear. They were allowed to make little plea arrangements and things. So it's a real difference in treatment for basically the same crime. And frankly, I'm incensed, and I think many people are. So that's what's going on in Florida. And we've had people offer their legal services to try to help these unfortunate people. And the governor has threatened / promised many more prosecutions. So we're on high alert, and that, we have some good things going on in terms of trying to build a pathway to help people. And then we have the governor piling on.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Thank you for your work, and thank you to the folks on the ground in Florida who are working to perfect democracy rather than suppress it. That's incredibly important. It also speaks to a cautionary tale. Since the late 90s, the Sentencing Project has documented that 24 states and Washington, D.C. has expanded rights to people with prior felony conviction histories. 7 states either repealed or amended lifetime disenfranchisement laws. 6 states expanded voting rights to some or all persons under community supervision. 17 states eased the restoration process for persons seeking to have the right to vote restored after completing their sentence. And as we've mentioned with Washington, D.C., 4 jurisdictions now allow people with felonies to vote during imprisonment. Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, since the 80s, have affirmatively expanded that, and people never lost their right to vote in Maine or Vermont. And the Sentencing Project recently partnered with national partners on a survey that found that 56% of likely voters support voting for people who are completing their sentence inside and out of prison. And even when the word felony is used, 50% of likely voters still support expanding the franchise and people voting who are completing their sentence inside and outside of prison. So despite the rollbacks in Florida and what you, Cecile, and your other activists in Florida are going through, this conversation that we're having today and the work on the folks on this call and who are in this audience are on the right side of history and working to expand the franchise to everyone, including those who are completing their sentence. It speaks to what is needed after political rights are won. And so I wanted to get into the implementation question, which is often a struggle after voting rights have been gained, and speaks to the challenges in Florida. So James and Representative Simmons, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation and offer to you, Cecile, to add additional context as well. Once rights have been won, what is needed in terms of notification and guaranteeing ballot access for people who are newly legally eligible to vote despite their criminal conviction history? Representative Simmons, let's start with you, and then we'll go to you, James, and round out with you, Cecile.
Yeah, I mean, first, people need to know that they have their rights restored. So right now, the Washington Voting Rights Restoration Coalition is doing an amazing job partnering with so many organizations across the nation, actually are helping us get the word out. We have advertisements on city buses. We have a lot of communications going on, social media and things like that. And then within our own communities, letting people know that your rights have been restored. Second, we need people to be bought in and want to vote and understand how important it is for them to use that tool. And so educating people about the big picture of how we're going to, fix all the inequities in our systems, not just the criminal legal system, but in healthcare and education, environmental justice, everything, and we need them to vote. So getting people bought in emotionally and knowing they have the right. But then lastly, sometimes it is actually they don't have access to their ballot. We're very fortunate here in Washington State. We have same-day registration. We have automatic registration for youth. We have prepaid. It's all by a mail, and there's no postage required. So we've done a lot of different types of reforms to make the actual act of voting more accessible for everyone. But when you're in jail, you cannot go on the internet and register. When you're in jail, your ballot probably got mailed to your home address or your last known address. So we do need support in working with our counties, each county sheriff and auditor, to make sure that people that are currently in our jails are having access. And so what that means is we're sending out funding and grants. So the sheriff and the county auditor can partner with people with lived experience, get them their background checks and do that, to go into the jail, to register people and to make sure they have a paper ballot so they can actually use their legal right and use their voice. So it's a lot of work to actually implement these laws, and we can't lose sight of that piece. Once we pass a law, we can't just say, oh, we won, let's go home. People all across the nation have an ability to help with volunteering at the polls, getting to know what's going on the ground, not just for people with criminal history, but for all people. We do need election workers all across the nation. We know that. So there's opportunity for everyone on this Zoom to participate and to support the efforts.
Thank you so much for that very helpful next steps that people can be taking. James, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, same, a lot of the same things that Ms. Simmons spoke about, registration, getting the ballots to the guys incarcerated, getting those ballots to them. I was formerly incarcerated myself, served 24 years. So when first time I was able to vote in 2020 in the main election, so it was exciting for me. But what we learned in this past election is just getting the guys educated on the local candidates at the local level, because their issues are not where the new bike trails are going to be at or stuff like that. Their issues kind of revolve around their situation. So just educating them on the different platforms from the different candidates and things of that nature. The ballots was a big problem. Sending them in where they be recognized as legal mail or regular mail, that had a big difference on them being allowed to receive the ballots. So it's a lot of work to be done. With their registration number being on the ballot or not on the ballot can affect whether they vote is processed. It's just so many different issues. It's a lot of work to be done, as she said. Uniformity to the whole process and oversight. Like I said, the Bureau of Prison has so many different prisons that each warden might have a different approach to it, or each mailroom might have a different approach to it. And the result of that was a lot of guys never receiving their ballots. So it's just a lot of work to be done. And even in educating them in voting, you got to be careful that you're not looking like you're trying to advocate for a specific candidate. And that could be a problem as well. So trying to get them information on the candidates in a neutral fashion, so it won't, look like you're picking sides. And like she said, everyone can help, and all information is good. That any insight that anyone wants to provide, we open for.
Thank you. And I want to stay with you just one more minute, James, because can you explain the strategy that you and your colleagues with More Than Our Crimes are engaging with to reach back out to the guys and women who are inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons to let them know about their voting rights? So you talked about guaranteeing ballot access and working with them on obtaining their ballots. But what is the strategy that you all have developed to make sure that folks inside of the various Federal Bureau of Prisons know about their voting rights and are engaging with you all, in democracy and in electoral education? So
what we did was, in the federal prison, they have access to core links, which is an email system. So we sent all of them our email address, the ones that, the one or two, they could report any problems that they're having. We also emailed them different platforms different issues that the candidates were known for. It was kind of hard to get certain issues in local elections in DC. So if we would just look at it, like we would gauge it as if a candidate is speaking on, let's say, like criminal justice reform, because that's something that like a lot of the guys were into, and they didn't have nothing specific. So we would just kind of get them information on the leanings of that candidate in regards to, are they more pro criminal justice, like police, or leaning the other way if they worried about inequitable housing, or just having more empathy, just give them some type of overview of the different candidates. So it was just so much stuff that we did in that regard. Also, mail, we wrote letters to each of the people there in different prisons. We had like someone that could take control of each prison. Not control, but like a guy that had influence in the prison. He would like organize within the prison, and he would deal with him, and he would write back the concerns of that jail or what's going on and things of that nature. But like I said, DC is hard. It's hard in DC because all our prisoners are sent all over the country. As opposed to like a state like Washington, where Ms. Simmons is at, they have their own BOP, Bureau of Prisons, so it's a little different.
Yeah, it is, but I do think as we work to expand the vote inside the walls, documenting and identifying best practices where voting while in criminal custody is happening and what the best ways to do that are going to be important. So the work that you all are doing with More Than Our Crimes in working on ballot access and voter registration for the more than 2,000 DC residents who are in custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons is critical. And the voting while incarcerated across the many jails across the country is so important too. So the work that Representative Simmons spoke to earlier in terms of Washington State funding, incentivizing and encouraging voting while incarcerated amongst the county jails throughout the state is an important best practice and something hopefully that other advocates and lawmakers will consider. So Cecile, many of your League of Women Voters colleagues are in the chat weighing in on possibilities in their jurisdictions and their localities beyond Florida. So I'm curious from your perspective, building off of Representative Simmons and James's comments, what would be helpful in terms of implementation? You already talked about the legal support that the League of Women Voters of Florida is developing. Do you have guidance or suggestions for your colleagues in other leagues across the country in support of implementation as well?
I have a little notebook and I'm taking notes from things that Representative Simmons and Mr. Carpenter have mentioned. I love the idea of that Mr. Carpenter mentioned about having individuals sort of assigned to different prisons, because they are so unique. My husband is a criminal defense lawyer, so he tells me, oh, I'm a civil rights lawyer on the civil side. But he said, oh, this jail or this, and he's all up in arms because there's some funny thing they're doing. And that's so important to have so that's something we're going to work towards now. I learned something at this event that I wasn't thinking of, is to delegate someone to, hey, find out what their procedures are, because we're developing a PowerPoint right now to inform people in prison about the opportunity to vote, because in Florida it's a little more complicated. It's not the automatic thing, the switch that we had wanted. It's been changed by the legislators. We also found that many returning citizens are unaware. They are unaware, and it's a good reason. If I
Oh dear, I think Cecile is having a little technical difficulties there. We'll see if she can come back. Hopefully she'll. Morgan, can you help her? Good, here you are.
I'm here. I see my.
We hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I see my. Okay, wonderful. I was saying we have the same issue where when we talk with returning citizens, they're unaware that the law has changed, because it's been, you get a felony, you catch a felony, your rights are taken almost for life. So there's hundreds of thousands of people who have not been paying attention because civic engagement wasn't something they could participate in. So they're not necessarily reading the paper. They're not paying attention to what legislation is going on. And so what we started, we did a partnership with the ACLU, and the league sent postcards to about 250,000 people who had finished their sentences and didn't have any financial fines and fees. And of that group, well, some had died, some had moved, but we got about 30,000 people who then, shortly after they got the postcard, registered because they had no fines and fees. So we are also in the process of trying to, get that bullhorn and let people know that there's been this massive change in the law. And I was saying, and it might have been when my voice went out, but I got an idea from James, Mr. Carpenter, when he talked about assigning a specific person to each prison to find out how to get information in that environment. So that's something I wrote down, and we're going to look at that as a possibility. So if anybody's interested in volunteering, I can put my email in the chat, and also they can communicate through the number that was posted and the Can I Vote at lwvfl.org. I am Cecile at lwvfl.org, and I'll write it out. But we need help. We need interested people on many levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile, and thank you all for your comments. We are going to go to questions, Q&A. So Monica, I want to invite you to come back on because we're co-hosting this together. So I wanted to invite you to ask the first question. There's several in the Q&A, but didn't know if there were other questions that you wanted to start with.
Sure, Nicole, thank you. And I will ping, because someone in the Q&A asked if there was the resources that you've been sort of sharing, especially at the beginning. So I don't know if you want to sort of share some of the links to the Sentencing Project's work that spoke to some of the resources and statistics that you sort of cited at the beginning. I want to sort of pose a question. I'm sort of merging maybe two into one for the panelists. One, because someone had asked sort of like robust sort of like best practices and advocacy strategies as it relates to sort of getting at some of the successful reforms that you guys have implemented in your states. But I also want to combine that with a question about that one, I think a person asks about what can be done to sort of perfect democracy without sort of entrenching marginalization of people living with certain convictions. And I think that speaks to some of what we had talked about at the beginning when you're talking about sort of the patchwork of laws to restore your rights. And some can be sort of like at the position of when you leave, finishing period of parole or probation, paying fines and fees, but also of ones that are sort of targeting or sort of excluding those based on a certain type of conviction. So I want to pose sort of that question starting off to our panelists.
Yeah, I saw the question and how some people were excluded. And fortunately, here in Washington, we made a commitment that we were not going to accept that. I think voting, there is the arguments that we used against any kind of, carving out for certain types of offenses, was that there's no public safety risk with voting. There is only a public safety benefit. It does not matter You can judge a person by the seriousness of their crime. For example, a lot of people go to people that have been convicted of sex offenses as a special protected. But the people who have already, and we were, advocating for complete reenfranchisement as soon as you leave prison. So the argument was people have served their time and they've been sentenced accordingly to the seriousness of their crime. They've already done that part of the punishment. This is about reentry, and actually if people become voters and they have a stake in their community, there's actually public safety benefits associated with that. Less likely to reoffend, more connected to community, more involved in things outside of basic living needs. And so I think that was the argument that really helped us make sure we were not having any carve-outs. Of course, I can also say that in a place where we have a trifecta and, we have Democrat control of all three voting bodies. And so it was a lot easier, I think, for us. I just had to get my moderate Democrat friends to get there, which, I was able to do with other tactics, such as withholding votes on their bills. So again, why we need directly impacted people who will prioritize this issue, right? Because what I'm learning is that, legislators are elected by their constituents. I don't have a prison in my district. And so I don't have a lot of people emailing me about voting rights or for my population, my people. And so people are torn on the district that they represent and what they're going to prioritize. They might have to prioritize a healthcare bill because it's going to impact, tens of thousands of people in their district, their voters. But I was able to prioritize these issues, and I'm going to continue to prioritize these issues as long as I'm serving, because this is exactly why I ran. And we need to have sentencing reform and collateral consequences, expunge all that stuff. So anyway, I think, the argument is that there's public safety benefits for all people, and the seriousness of the crime was already taken into consideration at the sentencing phase. So.
Yes, to both of you, all of your comments there, Representative Simmons. It's also helpful to know that it's public safety to keep people connected to their community, even while completing their sentence. That's why so inspired by the outcome of the survey that the Sentencing Project partnered with groups like Common Cause, Stand Up America, and State Innovation Exchange on, which found that 56% of likely voters support people still voting who are completing their sentence inside and outside of prison. So this conversation is on the right side of history, and guaranteeing ballot access and ensuring that people never lose their right to vote once they get them is a public safety strategy, particularly in terms of community connection and community safety. Were there any other questions, Monica, that you wanted to make sure to ask?
Sure. I mean, there's definitely a lot of questions. I'm going to sort of try to lump in a lot of them. So there's several questions, I think. One for you, Representative Simmons, in terms of sort of the jail-based voting practices. And so maybe if you want to sort of explain a little bit more on that, and for any of the panelists, actually, because one question is asking for incentives in terms of for jail-based voting programs. One person at the very, very beginning of the program sort of sought out and listed sort of some of the obstacles to some of the jail-based voting programs. So I don't know if you guys have sort of some best practices and or can go into sort of what the jail-based voting may look like for your particular jurisdictions.
Yeah, I did see a question about, can we just mail in the ballots? Unfortunately, because the turnover in jail is so quick, you have to go in there at strategic times and do it in the same day, because people will leave. I think the estimated length of stay in our county jail is like 5 or 7 days. That's the average. People aren't there for a long period of time. So we can't just mail them in and then have them return them. We'll miss people. So we have to do it at strategic times, and incentivizing the county and the sheriff. So the local county budgets are different than the state budget. So if the state can send money to the local county budgets, they're incentivized to create the system. And then we have asked for people with lived experience to go in there and explain to people like why it's important. What are the issues you care about? you know, and get them bought in. And then also through that, we're building relationships with people. So when they come home, they have a community, they know where to go to find their people, so they can feel connected and get into understanding, like, who are the housing providers that will rent to people with criminal history? Who are the employers that will give jobs to people with criminal history? So, you know, doing this model of sending in people with lived experience who are connected to community and know resources for people upon reentry is really helping so many things at once, and all centered around the vote. But we're doing you know, more than just getting people to vote. We're getting them connected to their community.
I'd like to weigh in a little bit to reiterate what Representative Simmons is saying. Having, for example, we have the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition led by Desmond Meade and other groups, but them in particular. And I just witnessed it this weekend, the love, the sisterhood, the brotherhood that exists. There's no need to explain. I just can imagine just that safety net, that support. People have the steps to help get a job, where to live, you know, how to start a business, just so many things where they share. So that's key. But I wanted to go back to your earlier question, Monica, with regards to, you know, why don't we open it up? Amendment 4 in particular has in the amendment specific exceptions for those who have murder convictions and those who've committed felony sex offenses. And I want to say two or three things about that. I was an activist before I became a leader in the league, and I try to take my activism with my leadership role, and I get on the street. I'm a street lady, and I get people to sign petitions. I'm sweating with my little hat. I'm at the football game, didn't see the game, but I'm out there, you know, talking to the people. So I literally probably had about 500 people that I got to sign the petition to put it on the ballot. And I made it a point, despite what I look like, right? I didn't just pick people I thought was going to smile at me and be nice. And I'm a soror. I got my pink and green, my AKs, my pearls. So my sorors would come to me because I would use, you know, connective, whatever is going to connect. And the other Divine Nine would come up, oh, soror, you know, and this and that. But if I wasn't in that football game, I would be at the grocery store. And I'd see, you know, Mr. Boat Lover with his little hat and his Confederate thing on his shirt, chewing his tobacco. And I made it a point to talk to everybody, regardless of what they look like. And I'm going to tell you something. About 10% of everybody, regardless of what they look like, how much money in their pocket, they would voluntarily say to me, well, I don't want it for murderers, and I don't want felonies. I don't want sex offenders. They wouldn't say felony. They'd say, I don't want sex offenders. I never said anything about it. They would tell me, ask me, lady, who does that include? So it was interesting that in our community in Florida, there were certain categories that people literally said before I explained anything. It's just something to note. And I think when in Florida, there are people who were working on Amendment 4, they actually had done some research. And they probably found what I found. Mine was very unscientific at this grocery store, at Walmart, here, there, everywhere. But
thank you, Cecile.
Something
thank you so much. Yeah,
if I could.
It was just something that was there. So I don't know if it would have passed.
Monica, I did want to bring James in too, because in DC, the expansion did not have any carve outs on it. And is curious about James's perspective as someone who got his voting rights back while still in prison, and the implications of carve-outs from his perspective.
I do want to say that just for democracy as a whole, it has a lot, not dealing with the carve-out subject, but just democracy as a whole. It had a lot to do. It just helps the discourse to have that voting bloc have an opportunity to leverage their vote in regards to issues that they want to have addressed. So now the candidates have to have them on the platform. They have to consider them. And it affects criminal justice reform. And we have so many laws changing in DC in regards to criminal justice reform, because they have to even consider that population. And it just helps democracy. It helps to improve things. as it was intended to do. So having those incarcerated be able to vote is great for the democracy as a whole, in my opinion, and from what I've seen with my own eyes. For myself, voting for the first time, like Ms. Simmons said, I wasn't really focused on the candidates and stuff like that. It was just a whirlwind process. But going forward, I know we realized that we do have to get the guys inside more information in a pamphlet form, bios, things of that nature. But DC is unique because they were full-fledged behind the process. It's not much pushback here. Everybody it follows the infrastructure of it, the political establishment, everyone is for it, so that we didn't have many issues as other states had.
Thank you for that, James. So we have a few minutes left. Did want to lift up a colleague, Avalon Betts Gaston's comment, where she noted in the chat that in the Cook County primary in Chicago, Cook County Jail has a polling station at the jail. And during the last primary, more people voted at the Cook County Jail than they voted in the general election. And that's because a polling station through state legislation was authorized and established at the jail in Cook County. And so that is a best practice to lift up and to consider. It may seem far off for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, where many DC residents who are legally eligible to vote, as well as residents who from Vermont and Maine who are in federal prison can vote in BOP as well. But it may seem far off for BOP to allow polling stations in the many BOP lockups around the country where there are legally eligible voters. But that is a best practice to work towards. And it's a best practice to work towards in states where the franchise is currently available for people who are in criminal custody, either at the jail level, and where people are working to expand voting rights inside prison walls and inside of state facilities. So we have just a few minutes left for maybe one or two more questions. Monica, was there any other question that you wanted to ask?
There's definitely a lot of questions and activity in the Q&A, but I want to give our speakers a chance to sort of have a closing remarks and sort of any calls to action that they have.
I would say one of the things that we used in getting the petition signed is the exact same thing that Representative Simmons said. The whole idea that when people get civically involved and they get the right to vote, we actually had a study from the governor's office, our old governor Scott, he did a study and we quoted it, that recidivism went down more than 30%. And that was like a clincher. So I think if we just move with that and share that information, whoever is in doubt will be won over. It's not only American and it's for our democracy, it's for everybody. Everybody benefits.
Yeah, thank you, Cecile. I think I used that study in the effort to pass our bill in 2021. And, you know, I guess one thing I just want to say is that it really does hurt my heart that this is such a partisan issue at times. I've really been trying to work to build bipartisan support because it makes things so much easier. And I did see a comment in there around not everybody who gets their voting rights back votes for their best interest. I will say we do have many people who I don't agree with politically on most things that are formerly incarcerated. You know, I think the more I can try to get those people to speak with their Republican representatives, I'm trying to bring them around. I want complete reenfranchisement in my state. I want people in prison, the 13,000 or so folks who are still disenfranchised to be able to vote. And so we're going to need a supermajority. It's going to need to be a bipartisan effort. One of the other things I really strongly believe is that when currently incarcerated people can vote, legislators will start to see them as constituents. And then, you know, they'll pay more attention to what's going on in our prisons. That's not political either. It's not partisan. You know, no matter what reason you care about the conditions of confinement, you care about public safety, you want people to come home and have opportunity and to not go back. Whether you care about all of the lawsuits against the medical neglect in our prisons, there's so many reasons why legislators should care about what's going on in prisons, but they're not voting. So legislators are not paying attention and prioritizing sentencing, reform, conditions of confinement, reentry. But if we can get people currently incarcerated to vote, then I think more legislators will visit a prison and care about the conditions and what's happening. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but I'm trying to build that bipartisan support.
James, you want to round us out with the last comment?
Everyone just stay engaged and keep your eye on it, because it's a political issue, like you said. So everyone just stay engaged.
And thank you all. Thank you for your comments. Thank you to the folks in the audience who have been incredibly engaged with sharing a lot of information from their own jurisdictions and their own activism into the great questions in the Q&A. So we're gonna wrap up now, but this is a kickoff, y'all. We are in Voting Rights Month, National Voting Rights Month, and we are in voting rights season as we head towards November 8th. So first of all, I hope everybody's registered to vote. That's one thing. And then number two, I hope folks are engaging in their state and local coalitions around this work, participating in a jail-based voter registration initiative, helping out in coalitions to lay the foundation for 2023, in advocating for new policies, new laws, organizing around new policy goals to expand the franchise. And I hope folks are helping to guarantee the vote for the folks at the Federal Bureau of Prisons who are legally eligible to vote, and for folks in their local jails and county jails who are legally eligible to vote. There's many questions about, will there be a recording? Of course, we are 3 years into this pandemic, y'all. There's always a recording on Zoom, and there will be one for this. We're also gonna follow up with you all over email with many resources and some of the documents that people mentioned during the call today. And this is just the beginning. We have the month of September, but actually we have several months up through November 8th. So please stay in touch, stay engaged, and connect with us as we work to expand the vote and work to guarantee the vote for those who are legally eligible to participate in the franchise. So thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists for joining us today.